For 6 months I told myself I was just being a good father, that a grandchild on the way was worth any small humiliation, that a man who'd raised one son alone, after burying his wife of 41 years, could survive being moved into his own pool house like a piece of patio furniture. I told myself a lot of things in those 6 months. None of them were true. What was true is this. By the time my son sat across from me at the dinner table in the house I designed and paid for, and screamed loud enough that the woman next door called to ask if everything was all right, I had already met with my attorney 3 times. I had a manila folder in the locked drawer of my drafting desk that contained 2 recordings, a stack of bank statements, a private investigator's report out of Sacramento, and a notarized affidavit. I had a moving company booked for the following Tuesday, and I had a key to a small bungalow in Cambria, California, that nobody in that dining room knew existed. My name doesn't matter much for this story. Call me a retired architect, 71 years old, widowed 22 months. I had spent 43 years designing custom homes up and down the Central Coast, and the house we were sitting in that night was the one I had built for my late wife Lenore as a 40th anniversary gift. 5 bedrooms. Spanish Revival. A view of the live oaks from the kitchen sink that she had asked for specifically because she liked to watch the deer come down at dusk while she did the dishes. She got 11 months in that house before the pancreatic cancer took her. My son moved in 3 weeks after the funeral. I want to be honest about how that happened, because the people in the comments on the last family video I ever scrolled through were not kind about a father who, quote, simply accepted his own degradation. I understand the criticism. I also understand grief in a way that I hope nobody reading this ever has to. When Lenore died, I stopped sleeping. I would walk through that house at 3 in the morning in my bathrobe, opening cabinets, looking at her handwriting on the masking tape she'd used to label the spice jars. Cinnamon, cumin, smoked paprika. I would stand in front of the spice rack and cry until I couldn't see. So when my son, my only child, the boy whose first steps I had filmed on a camcorder in 1986, called me from Denver and said he and his wife wanted to move back to be close to me, I cried again, but for the first time in months, it was not the same kind of crying. I said yes before he finished the sentence. His name was Derek. He was 34. He had been a decent kid and a tolerable teenager and an adult. I had a hard time recognizing. He worked in something he called brand strategy, which as far as I ever understood meant he posted things on the internet and occasionally flew to Austin. His wife was named Brindle, and they had been married for 18 months when they showed up in my driveway with a U-Haul and a French bulldog named Mussolini. I'm going to skip ahead because the early weeks were the kind of bittersweet that doesn't translate. Derek made coffee in the mornings the way Lenore used to. He'd bring me a cup at the drafting desk where I still did consulting work, and he'd ask about the projects. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt like maybe the next 20 years could still be a life. Brindle was polite. She organized the pantry, which I admit annoyed me, and she had a way of complimenting the house that made it sound like she was complimenting a hotel she'd checked into, but she was friendly enough. She called me Pop, which I'd never been called before and which I quietly enjoyed. The first crack came at Thanksgiving. Brindle's mother flew in from Phoenix, a woman named Roxanne, who wore enormous turquoise rings, and asked me, within 45 minutes of meeting me, whether I had considered downsizing. I laughed and said, no, this was my home. She smiled the kind of smile that I have since learned to recognize, and she said, of course, but 5 bedrooms for one man at your age, it's just so much to maintain. I said my son and his wife lived here too. She said yes, but for how long? I didn't think much about it at the time. I thought she was just being a mother, fishing for information about her daughter's future. I should have thought more about it. The second crack came on January 19th, which I remember because it was Lenore's birthday and I had spent the day at the cemetery. When I came home in the evening, Brindle was sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop open and her face arranged in a particular way. I was about to learn very well. She said, Pop, I need to tell you something, and I want you to be excited for us. I sat down. She told me she was pregnant. I cried. I am not embarrassed to say I cried in front of my daughter-in-law on the night of my dead wife's birthday, because my son was going to be a father. Derek came in from the garage, and the 3 of us hugged. and Mussolini ran in circles around our ankles, and for about 11 minutes I felt something close to joy. Then Brindle said, "So we wanted to talk to you about the rooms." She had it all worked out. The main bedroom, my bedroom, the one Lenore and I had shared, the one where I still slept on the same side I had slept on for the entire marriage. That was the most logical place for the nursery. It had the ensuite, which would be useful for nighttime feedings. It had the bay window, which she had already pinned ideas about. Something about a reading nook and a Roman shade in a sage green. She had measured. She showed me the measurements. I asked where I would go. She said, "Well, the upstairs bedrooms are all going to be needed. The one at the end of the hall would be the baby's room for naps, and the room across from the main was already her office, and the one above the garage they used as a guest room because her mother was going to be visiting often, and the one at the front of the house was already converted into Derek's podcast studio, which I hadn't known he had, or that he'd converted a room without asking me." I sat there counting on my fingers. 5 bedrooms. All accounted for. Not one for me. She said, "We thought the pool house would be perfect. We can put in a mini split. You have so much privacy. You'd be your own man down there. It would be like a man cave." I'm 71. I have built houses for federal judges and one minor television actor. I have never wanted a man cave in my life. The pool house was 480 square feet, designed for guests to change out of swimsuits and not for habitation. It had no proper insulation. The plumbing was for a shower and a half bath only, no kitchen. In the winter on the Central Coast, the marine layer rolls through, and even with a mini split, it would be cold and damp. I said, "Can I think about it?" Derek spoke for the first time. He said, "Dad, come on. It's just temporary. Until the baby's older. It's just a few years." Live in a pool house at my age. I said I'd think about it, and I went to my bedroom, the bedroom my wife had picked the pink color for, a soft white she had called dove wing. And I sat on the edge of the bed and I did not cry because I had cried enough that day at a cemetery. I just sat there. And I want to be clear about what I was feeling, because I think the people who say I should have grown a spine immediately don't understand grief, or family, or the particular weakness of a man who has buried his only equal partner, and now finds himself trying to be both gentle and useful to a son he hasn't figured out how to be a father to, since the wife who translated between them died. I moved into the pool house on February 8th, the first night. I lay on the trundle bed they had set up for me, and I listened to the pool filter cycle on at 2 a.m., and I told myself this was a season. I told myself my grandchild would know me. I told myself a man can sleep anywhere if his family is sleeping under a roof he built. I believed those things for about 6 weeks. What changed was the Tuesday in mid-March when I came up to the main house to get my mail, and I overheard Brindle on the phone. She was in the dining room, which has a particular acoustic property because of the coffered ceiling I'd designed, and I was standing in the mudroom out of sight. She didn't know I was there. She was talking to someone she called Mama. She was laughing. She said, No, he's totally out in the pool house now, it's done. She said, the next step is just patience. She said, I told you, Derek is the easiest part of all of this. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him. And then she said the thing that ended my season of telling myself comfortable lies. She said, by Christmas, the whole place will be in my name. And once that's done, the old man is somebody else's problem. The old man. I'm going to tell you what I did, because I think this is the part the people in those comments wanted to hear about the most. I did not confront her. I did not slam the door. I did not march into the kitchen and demand my son explain himself. I went back to the pool house. I sat on the trundle bed. I shook for about 10 minutes, partly from anger and partly from something closer to fear, because at 71 you start to understand that your remaining good years are finite, and you have just heard somebody planning to spend them eating you alive. And then I called Marvin. Marvin had been my attorney since 1991. He had handled my business, my will, the trust Lenore and I had set up when she got sick. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did, and I told him what I had heard. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Can you record her saying anything similar?" He said, "In California, we are a two-party consent state, so we need to be careful. But if she repeats those statements on a phone call in a part of the house where you also live, there are arguments." He said, "More importantly, get me a list of every document Derek has asked you to sign in the last 6 months." He said, "Also, has she been talking about the deed?" I thought about it. She had. 3 times that I could remember. Once she had mentioned a estate planning seminar she had attended in San Luis Obispo. Once she had asked, very casually, if my will had been updated since Lenore had passed. Once she had brought up something she called a ladybird deed and asked if I had heard of it. I had said no. Marvin said, "Get me their full names. Brindle's maiden name. Anything you can find." He said, "I'm going to call a man I know in Sacramento." He said, "In the meantime, do not sign anything. Do not initial anything. Do not initial anything. Do not let her near your mail. Do not change your locks yet because we don't want to spook her. Just keep being the old man in the pool house until I tell you otherwise." I have to tell you, hanging up that phone, I felt something I had not felt since before Lenore got sick. I felt like a man with a job to do. The next morning I started a notebook. I wrote down every conversation. The date Brindle had asked about my will. The date Derek had mentioned, very casually, that it might be smart to put me on their checking account for emergencies. The date Roxanne had flown in for a week, and the 3 of them had sat at the dining room table with a yellow legal pad for 2 hours while I was at a dentist appointment. I wrote down what I remembered, and I wrote down what I overheard, and twice I wrote down things I had ignored at the time and now saw differently. For example, 6 weeks before the move to the pool house, my favorite watch had disappeared. A Hamilton my father gave me when I graduated from architecture school in 1976. I had assumed I'd misplaced it. Now I wondered. 3 weeks before the move, the original blueprints for the house had vanished from the flat file in my office. I had assumed I'd filed them somewhere else. Now I wondered. 10 days before the move, the safe deposit box key had stopped being where I always kept it, in the second drawer of the desk under a coaster from a hotel in Santa Barbara. Brindle had helped me look for it. We never found it. The bank had charged me $40 to drill the box. The box had contained Lenore's wedding ring, my mother's pearl necklace, and the original deed. I called the bank. I asked for the security footage from the day the key had gone missing. They told me they could not release it without a subpoena. I called Marvin. Marvin said, "That's fine. We'll have one soon." 3 weeks after I started the notebook, Marvin called me back. He said, "I want you to sit down." I sat down. He said, "My friend in Sacramento ran the names." He said, "Your daughter-in-law's actual name is not Brindle. Her real name was something else. It was a common name, a name a lot of women in this country have. She had legally changed it 8 years ago, in a county where the records were easier to lose than to find. Before that, she had been involved in what Marvin called a situation in Reno with a man in his 60s. After that, a situation in Phoenix with a man in his 70s. The man in Phoenix was Roxanne's second husband. Roxanne was not actually Brindle's mother. Roxanne was Brindle's older sister. Marvin said, "This is a team." He said, "They've been running this for a decade." He said, "The Phoenix man died of what was ruled natural causes and left half his estate to a stepdaughter who was not actually his stepdaughter." He said, "The Reno man is in a memory care facility now, and his sons are still trying to claw back property." He said, "Your son almost certainly does not know any of this. Your son is the mark." I want to tell you what I felt when Marvin said that. I felt sick. I felt sick because I had been so busy being humiliated by my son, that I had not seen that my son was being eaten too. I had been so busy being a father in pain that I had not been a father at all. The boy whose first steps I had filmed in 1986 had married a woman who was going to leave him broke and confused after she had bled me out first. I asked Marvin what to do. He said, "We have to do this carefully." He said, "We cannot tip her off, because if she runs, we don't get the money back, and there is money to get back." He said, "Your son needs to hear it from her own mouth, recorded in a way that he can't explain away." He said, "Are you willing to wear a wire?" I said yes. The next 6 weeks were the hardest acting job of my life. I went up to the main house for dinner 3 nights a week, the way I had been doing. I smiled at Brindle. I asked about the pregnancy, which I now suspected was a lie, and which a doctor's records request through Marvin later confirmed was. I complimented her cooking. I let her hug me. I let her call me Pop. And one Sunday in late April, I drove her to a paint store in Morro Bay to help her pick a color for the nursery in my bedroom. And on the drive home, I steered the conversation, gently, jointly, toward money. I said I was thinking about updating my will. I said I was worried about Derek, that he wasn't great with finances. I said I wondered if there was a way to leave things to her instead because she struck me as the responsible one. She didn't bite right away. She was good. But over the next 10 days, over 4 separate conversations, 3 of them recorded on a small device clipped inside my shirt pocket, she fed me everything Marvin needed. She told me about the Ladybird deed. She told me about a trust she said her cousin set up. She told me that Derek was, quote, "not built for this kind of thing," and that the smartest thing I could do for the baby was to put everything in her name and let her be the steward. She used that word, steward. On the 3rd recording, on May the 2nd, she said something I am going to remember until the day I die. She said, "You know, Pop, I really do love you. I think you're the closest thing to a real father I've had, and I want you to know that whatever happens, I am going to take care of you, the way you should have been taken care of all along." 3 days later, Marvin had everything he needed. We picked a Thursday. The reason we picked a Thursday is that Brindle had a hair appointment in San Luis Obispo at 4, and she would not be back until at least 6:30, which gave us a window. At 3:15 that afternoon, I went up to the main house. Derek was in the front room. He called his studio, recording something. I knocked on the door. I said, "Son, I need you to come out here, please." He came out. He looked annoyed. I said, "Sit down in the dining room. I have something to play for you." He said, "Dad, I'm in the middle of a take." I said, "Sit down." I think it was my voice. I had not used that voice with him since he was 18 and came home drunk in my car. He sat down. I played him the recording from May the 2nd. I played him the part where his wife told a man she called Pop that she loved him. I played him the part right after, where she laughed and said, "Of course, the trick is just making sure Derek doesn't realize what he's signing. He barely reads anything I put in front of him anyway." I played him the part where she said, "By Christmas, it'll all be done." He didn't say anything for a long time. I played him the recording from the Tuesday in mid-March. The old man is somebody else's problem. Then I opened the manila folder. I showed him the private investigator's report. I showed him the photographs of Brindle, at 23, with a different last name, getting into a car in Reno with a man who was not him. I showed him the marriage license Marvin had pulled, the one that proved Brindle and Roxanne had filed paperwork as sisters in the state of Nevada in 2017. I showed him the death certificate from Phoenix. I showed him the bank records, which I'm not going to describe in detail, but which made it very clear that money from the joint account he had set up at her urging had been moving, in small, careful amounts, to an account in a name he had never heard of. He started crying about halfway through. He said, "Dad, oh God, Dad." He said, "I didn't know." He said, "I swear to God, I didn't know." I believed him. I still believe him. He was a fool, my son. He was a fool, my son. He was vain and ungrateful, and he had let his wife move me into a pool house in the house his mother died in. And he was, beneath all of that, a fool. But he was not a thief. I said, "Son, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I said, in about 3 hours, your wife is going to come home. When she walks through that door, you are going to behave exactly the way you have behaved every other Thursday of this marriage. You are going to kiss her on the cheek. You are going to ask about her hair. You are not going to mention this conversation. You are not going to mention me. Tomorrow morning at 9, you are going to tell her you have a meeting in San Luis Obispo. Instead, you are going to drive to Marvin Tesler's office on Higuera Street. You are going to walk in. He will be expecting you. Do you understand? He nodded. He was still crying. I said one more thing. I said, you moved me into a pool house. You did that. Nobody made you do that. You did that to your father in the house your mother died in. I want you to sit with that. He said, Dad, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I said, I know. I went back to the pool house. I sat on the trundle bed. I called Marvin. I told him it was done. He said, get some sleep. I said, I'm not going to sleep tonight. He laughed. He said, no, probably not. The next morning at 9:14, Derek walked into Marvin's office. By 11, he had signed everything Marvin put in front of him, which was, I will admit, a poetic reversal. By 2 that afternoon, sheriff's deputies were at my front door with a warrant for Brindle's arrest on charges that included elder financial abuse, identity-related fraud, and a conspiracy charge involving Roxanne that Marvin's friend in Sacramento had been building a case on for almost a year. Brindle was not at the house. She was at a coffee shop in Cambria, of all places, where my new bungalow was, which I have always wondered about. They picked her up at the counter. She was ordering an oat milk latte. Roxanne was arrested in Phoenix 4 hours later. I'm going to tell you the ending, because the comments on these stories always say the endings feel rushed, or that the villain just disappears. Brindle, whose real name I will not put in writing because there is a child in this story now. A real child, born 5 months later to a woman in a county facility. That child is not her fault, and I don't want anyone tracking her down. Brindle pled out. She got 6 years, with a conspiracy charge and a prior pattern. The prosecutor told us she would likely serve 4. Roxanne, who had more priors and who was the actual brains of the operation, got 11. The money was harder. Marvin recovered about 68% of what they had taken from me, which was more than I had expected and less than I had hoped. The watch never turned up. The pearl necklace did, in a pawn shop in Bakersfield, and I bought it back myself because I did not want to wait on the legal process. Lenore's wedding ring was on Brindle's finger when they arrested her. I have it now. It is on my desk as I write this. Derek. My son. He is doing better than he deserves, and worse than I wish. He divorced Brindle from inside her preliminary hearing. He left Brand Strategy and went to work for a contractor in Atascadero, framing houses, which I find funny because his grandfather was a framer, and the boy refused for 30 years to learn how to swing a hammer. He calls me every Sunday. He drove out to Cambria last month and we ate fish tacos on my porch and watched the elephant seals at Piedras Blancas. He did not stay overnight. He did not ask to. I think he understood. The grandchild who was supposed to be did not exist. There never was a pregnancy. That was perhaps the cruelest thing of all. And the thing that I think wounded Derek the deepest, deeper than the money, deeper than the betrayal. He had been planning a nursery for a baby that was never coming. I bought the bungalow in Cambria 3 weeks before the dinner where my son shouted at me. I had picked it out the second week after I overheard Brindle on the phone. It has 2 bedrooms, a fireplace, and a window over the kitchen sink that looks out at a stand of cypress. And, beyond them, the ocean. Lenore would have liked it. She used to say that if we ever sold the big house, she wanted somewhere small and salty and quiet. I think about her every morning when I do the dishes. I think about the deer she used to watch in our old kitchen, and I think about how she would have hated Brindle, and how she would have loved how this ended, and how she would have made me eat breakfast before driving anywhere on the day I sat my son down and played him those recordings. The big house, the one I built for her, I sold in September. I could not live there again. The new owners are a couple from Seattle with 3 kids and a golden retriever. The day they moved in, I drove past once, slowly, and I saw a little girl swinging on the gate I had hung myself in 1998. And I drove home to Cambria, and I sat on my porch and I had a beer at 3 in the afternoon, which Lenore would have given me a look about, and I was all right. I want to say one last thing, because I know how these stories get talked about online, and I know what people say about men my age who let things happen to them. They say, grow a spine. They say, what kind of fool? They say, at your age, with your money, with your education. I have read those comments. I understand them. But I will tell you what I know now, at 71, that I did not know at 70. Grief makes you slow. It makes you grateful for warm bodies in your house, even when those bodies are taking from you. It makes you mistake being needed for being loved. The shame of the pool house was real. The cold mornings were real. The humiliation at that dinner table when my son shouted at me to give my wife my room, his voice cracking the way it used to crack when he was 13 and trying to sound like a man, all of that was real. But underneath it, the entire time, was a man with a manila folder and a phone call to make. The grief did not turn me into the fool they thought I was. The grief turned me into someone patient. And patience, it turns out, is the only thing in this world that beats a thief. I'm going to bed now. The cypress are loud tonight. The wind is up. Tomorrow, my son is driving out and we are going to spread some of his mother's ashes off the bluff at Moonstone Beach, which is something I have been waiting almost 2 years to do and which I would not have been able to do with her wedding ring still missing. I have it now. It is on my desk. The light from the lamp is catching it. It looks the way it always looked. Good night, Lenore. Good night to all of you. I've thought a lot, in the months since the sheriff's deputies walked Brindle out of that coffee shop in Cambria, about why this happened the way it did. Not the legal part. The human part. Why I let a woman I barely knew talk me into a pool house. Why my son, the boy I raised, sat across from me at a dinner table and screamed in a voice that cracked. Why it took me 6 months of cold mornings to call Marvin instead of 6 days. I keep coming back to a simple thing. Every choice in that house, mine and Derek's and even Brindle's, was a cause with a consequence waiting on the other side of it. Brindle chose a long con, and she earned 6 years in a state facility for it. Derek chose to stop reading the things his wife handed him to sign, and he earned a divorce, a framing job, and a Sunday phone call to a father he almost lost. I chose for half a year to confuse silence with peace, and I earned a trundle bed beside a pool filter and the slow education of a man too old to be that surprised by people. There's a kind of decency, the kind Lenore had, that knows when to stop being patient and start being honest. I didn't have it at first. Grief had hollowed me out. But underneath the hollowing, I'd spent 43 years building houses, which is the slow practice of believing that what you draw on Monday matters on Friday. That habit saved me. When I heard Brindle on the phone that Tuesday in March, I didn't roar. I drew. I took out a notebook, and I drew the situation the way I draw a foundation. That's not cunning. That's just refusing to let pain make your decisions for you. If there's anything I'd want a younger man, or even a man my age, to take from this, it's that being gentle and being weak are not the same animal. Being gentle is a choice you make from a position of strength. Being weak is what happens when you forget you had a choice. For 6 months, I forgot. The day I called Marvin, I remembered. And I'd say this too. Watch the people who tell you that loving them means signing things. Watch the people who use the word steward when they mean owner. Watch the people who use the word steward when they mean owner. Watch the people who measure your bedroom while your wife's birthday flowers are still on the table. Those are not warnings I learned in school. Those are warnings I learned at my own kitchen island. from a woman who called me Pop while planning to bury me. I'm 71. I have one son who is doing better than he deserves. I have a small house by the sea and a ring on my desk and a notebook and a drawer I will probably never need to open again. I have my wits, which the grief tried to take and which I took back. That, more than the money, is what I salvaged, and it's the only thing, in the end, that nobody can move into a pool house against your will.